Sometimes life doesn't close a door because it wants to punish you. Sometimes it closes every door except the one you were always meant to find. The cold October rain drifted across the foothills of northern Pennsylvania like a gray curtain, soft enough to hide the mountains, yet steady enough to soak through every layer a man could wear. Luke Dawson rested both hands on the worn steering wheel of his aging pickup truck, watching strangers carry the last cardboard box out of the little white house that had once been his. The porch lights still glowed beneath the rain, casting a warm circle onto the wooden steps where Ranger had spent countless evenings waiting for him after long days of work. Now another family stood inside the doorway, laughing quietly as they imagined a future that no longer belonged to him. Luke never stepped out of the truck. He had signed the final foreclosure papers 2 days earlier. There was nothing left to argue about, nothing left to save. His military pension had disappeared beneath legal disputes tied to an investigation that never truly made sense. The construction company he had spent years building collapsed under debts he couldn't repay. Friends slowly stopped calling. His marriage had faded beneath grief neither of them knew how to carry. One by one, every familiar piece of life had slipped away until only silence remained. Beside him, Ranger sat perfectly still in the passenger seat. The adult German shepherd watched the house with alert, intelligent eyes, his classic black and tan coat darkened by the mist collecting on the open window. He never barked. He simply stared as if trying to understand why the place that had always smelled like home suddenly belonged to someone else. Luke reached across the seat and rested his hand gently against the dog's neck. Years earlier, they had trusted each other through impossible situations overseas. Ranger had learned to detect dangers hidden beneath broken concrete and tangled steel, while Luke had learned to trust instincts that couldn't be explained with maps or reports. That trust had outlived every uniform, every paycheck, every title the world had once attached to his name. "Come on, buddy," Luke whispered. "We've worn out our welcome." He started the engine, and the pickup rolled quietly away from the only address he had ever imagined growing old in. By sunset, the highways narrowed into winding mountain roads bordered by dense forests glowing with autumn color. Golden maples and crimson oaks stretched across the hillsides while low clouds drifted between distant ridges like slow-moving rivers. Luke drove without a destination because there was nowhere left to reach. Eventually, he found an abandoned gravel turnout overlooking a valley wrapped in pine trees. A faded state sign leaned sideways near the edge of the overlook, its paint almost erased by decades of weather. It was quiet. Too quiet for most people. For Luke, silence had become familiar company. He shut off the engine. The ticking of cooling metal echoed inside the cab while rain tapped gently against the windshield. Ranger climbed into the truck bed for a few minutes before jumping back inside, circling once and settling near Luke's boots. Luke removed a faded metal box from beneath the passenger seat. Inside rested a Navy SEAL Challenge coin, a folded American flag, and an old photograph of 5 young men smiling beneath a blazing desert sunrise. 4 of those men had never made it home. Luke traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb before quietly returning it to the box. Some memories never became lighter. They simply became quieter. Darkness settled across the mountains. The rain eased into a mist, and the forest disappeared beneath layers of silver fog. Somewhere beyond the trees, an owl called once before everything became still again. Luke leaned back against the seat, closed his eyes, and listened to the peaceful rhythm of Ranger breathing nearby. It might have been enough to carry him through the night. Then Ranger suddenly lifted his head. Every muscle in the dog's body tightened. His ears pointed toward the forest, and he remained perfectly motionless, listening to something Luke could not hear. Seconds passed. Ranger climbed onto the seat and pressed his nose against the half-open window. His breathing changed. Then, from somewhere deep beyond the wall of towering pines, carried softly across the damp autumn air, came a single clear whistle. Luke's eyes opened immediately. His heartbeat slowed instead of quickening, because he recognized that sound. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't the wind. It was a military rally signal, one used only by the small Navy SEAL unit where Luke and Ranger had once served together. The whistle came again, distant but unmistakable. Ranger let out one low whine, never taking his eyes off the darkness. Luke stared into the forest where no lights existed, where no cabins appeared on any map he remembered driving, and where no one should have known that forgotten signal anymore. The man who had taught it to them had been declared dead nearly 9 years earlier. Ranger did not bark again. He simply climbed out through the open truck window with the smooth confidence of a partner following a familiar order, landing softly on the damp gravel before turning toward the dark wall of pine trees. Luke stepped out immediately, pulling the collar of his weathered jacket higher against the cool mountain air. The mist had thickened, drifting slowly between the trunks until the forest looked less like a collection of trees and more like an ocean of quiet shadows. The whistle never came a third time, yet Ranger remained completely focused, his ears standing high, his nose lifted into the faint breeze. Luke had seen that posture countless times during their years together. Ranger was not curious. He was tracking. That difference had saved lives before. He clipped the flashlight onto his belt, but deliberately left it switched off. Bright light often erased more than it revealed in heavy fog. Instead, he trusted the pale glow of the nearly full moon filtering through the clouds overhead. Ranger began walking at a steady pace, never rushing, never hesitating, weaving between towering pines whose trunks disappeared high above into silver darkness. Fallen needles softened every footstep until the forest seemed to swallow every sound except the distant drip of rainwater falling from branch to branch. Luke noticed something almost immediately. Ranger was not searching randomly. He was following a precise line, pausing only long enough to confirm a scent before moving forward again. After nearly 15 minutes of climbing gently uphill, Luke stopped beside a moss-covered boulder. The pattern beneath his boots looked strangely familiar. Several stones had been stacked deliberately along the trail, each separated by almost exactly the same distance. Most hikers would have dismissed them as natural formations, but Luke recognized field markers. During his years as a Navy SEAL, instructors had taught subtle navigation methods that left almost no trace behind. 3 stones meant continue. 1 flat stone leaning against another meant change elevation. Whoever placed these markers understood military movement. Luke looked toward Ranger, who had already continued another 30 yards before glancing back as if asking why his partner had stopped. "You remember something, do you?" Luke asked quietly. Ranger wagged his tail once before continuing. The simple gesture unsettled Luke more than he cared to admit. Dogs remembered places through scent. Yet nearly a decade had passed since they had left military service. Whatever Ranger recognized should not have remained here after so many seasons of rain and snow. The trail narrowed until dense mountain laurel brushed against Luke's sleeves. A small creek crossed their path, no wider than 6 feet, its water running clear over smooth stones polished by countless winters. Ranger stepped across effortlessly and waited on the opposite bank. As Luke followed, something metallic caught his eye beneath a thin layer of wet leaves near the water's edge. He crouched, brushing away the leaves with careful fingers until a weathered bronze coin appeared in his palm. Mud clung to its edges, but the engraved trident and eagle remained unmistakable. It was a Navy SEAL Challenge coin. Luke's breathing slowed. He turned it over. Scratched across the back by hand were the initials J.W., Commander Jonathan Warren, the man who had first taught Luke that distinctive rally whistle, the man whose memorial service had filled an entire chapel almost 9 years earlier. Luke stared at the coin for several long seconds before slipping it carefully into his pocket. "This cannot be possible," he whispered. Ranger responded by walking forward again without the slightest hesitation. The climb became steeper as enormous slabs of gray stone emerged from beneath the forest floor. Ferns grew between narrow cracks while vines wrapped themselves around ancient boulders that looked older than memory itself. Then Luke noticed something even stranger. Several tree trunks bore faint cuts shaped like narrow arrows, almost invisible beneath years of bark growth. They were old military trail signs, carved deliberately where only someone trained to notice them would ever look. Each one pointed in exactly the direction Ranger was already leading. Luke no longer believed they were wandering through coincidence. Someone had built this route. Someone had expected another soldier to find it one day. Nearly 40 minutes after leaving the truck, the trail ended without warning. A sheer wall of stone rose nearly 30 feet into the night sky, completely blocking further passage. Thick curtains of ivy spilled from the cliff, covering every inch of rock so completely that it appeared untouched by human hands. Ranger approached the vine slowly, sniffed once, then disappeared straight through them without making a sound. Luke hurried forward, pushing aside the heavy curtain of leaves. Behind it, hidden from every road, every map, and every passing eye, something impossible waited in the moonlight, and Luke could only stand frozen as the outline of a stone structure slowly emerged from the mountain itself. Luke slowly lowered the curtain of ivy behind him as though he feared the forest itself might decide to hide the place again. Before him stood a stone house unlike anything he had ever seen outside forgotten history books. It was built directly into the mountainside, its weathered gray stones blending so naturally with the cliff that it almost disappeared beneath the moonlight. Moss covered much of the roof, and climbing vines embraced the walls with the patience of decades. A narrow chimney rose from the center, leaning slightly but still standing with quiet dignity against the cold autumn sky. Every window was covered by thick wooden shutters faded nearly silver from countless winters. Nothing about the house suggested wealth. Instead, it carried the calm strength of something built to endure rather than impress. Ranger waited on the uneven stone steps leading to the front entrance. The adult German shepherd stood perfectly still, his alert, intelligent eyes fixed upon the heavy oak door. Luke climbed the worn steps one careful foot at a time. They felt surprisingly solid beneath his boots despite the years that must have passed since anyone had walked there. Kneeling beside the entrance, he brushed away layers of damp leaves gathered along the threshold. His fingers paused as they uncovered a weathered bronze emblem fastened beside the frame. Although age had softened its edges, the engraved anchor and trident remained unmistakable. It was another military symbol. Not decoration. Identification. Someone connected to the Navy had once claimed this place. Luke slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed Commander Jonathan Warren's challenge coin. The two emblems shared the same unusual design, including a tiny mountain silhouette carved beneath the anchor. His heartbeat grew heavier. Ranger gave a soft whine without taking his eyes from the door. Luke wrapped one hand around the old iron handle. The wood felt unexpectedly smooth, as though many careful hands had polished it over the years. He expected resistance from swollen timber or rusted hinges. Instead, the door moved inward with quiet ease, releasing the faint scent of cedar, old stone, and ashes that had long since grown cold. Cool air drifted gently out of the darkness. Luke remained standing in the doorway for several seconds before stepping inside. Moonlight slipped through narrow gaps around the shutters, painting long silver lines across a room that appeared frozen in time. A massive stone fireplace occupied the far wall. Above it rested a hand-carved wooden mantel displaying several framed photographs covered by thin layers of dust. A sturdy oak table stood near the center of the room, with four matching chairs arranged neatly around it, as though their owners had expected company at any moment. Shelves lined one wall from floor to ceiling, filled with books, glass jars, folded maps, and carefully labeled wooden boxes. Nothing looked abandoned. Everything looked intentionally preserved. Ranger walked slowly through the room, his paws making almost no sound against the wide pine floorboards. He sniffed each corner with quiet concentration before stopping near the fireplace. Rather than scratching or barking, he simply sat down and watched Luke. It was another familiar signal from years of working together. Ranger believed something important waited nearby. Luke first approached the mantel. One by one he lifted the dusty picture frames, gently wiping each glass with his sleeve. The first showed a younger Jonathan Warren standing beside three men wearing mountain rescue gear instead of military uniforms. The second captured the stone house during a bright summer morning decades earlier, surrounded by wildflowers and tall pines. Then Luke reached the third photograph. His breath caught before he realized why. Standing beside Jonathan Warren was another man wearing an old field jacket, smiling beneath the same front porch where Luke now stood. The resemblance struck him immediately. Broad shoulders, calm brown eyes, the familiar shape of his jaw. It was his father, Thomas Dawson, nearly 30 years younger than Luke remembered him. Luke stared silently at the photograph while memories drifted through his mind like leaves across still water. His father had rarely spoken about military service. He preferred fishing trips, quiet evenings repairing old tools, and teaching Luke that a promise mattered most when nobody else witnessed it. He had never once mentioned Jonathan Warren or a stone house hidden inside these mountains. Luke carefully turned the frame over. Written in faded black ink across the back were only 6 words. Brothers are chosen more than born. The handwriting belonged to Jonathan Warren. Ranger suddenly stood and walked directly to the fireplace. He lowered his nose toward the wide stone hearth before gently touching one particular stone with his paw. Once, then again, Luke knelt beside him, placing his hand against the cool granite surface. At first it felt perfectly ordinary. Then he noticed something unusual. One rectangular stone sat slightly lower than the others, almost invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Before Luke could examine it further, a faint mechanical click echoed somewhere deep behind the wall, followed by the soft humming sound of ancient machinery awakening after a very long silence. Luke remained perfectly still, his hand resting against the uneven stone while the faint mechanical hum echoed somewhere inside the mountain. It was not loud. In fact, it was so soft that another person might have mistaken it for the wind slipping through old cracks in the walls. But Luke had spent too many years listening for sounds that did not belong. Machines had rhythms. Water had rhythms. So did carefully hidden mechanisms designed to survive long after their builders were gone. Ranger stepped backward without fear, his tail hanging naturally behind him as he continued watching the fireplace. The dog was not warning Luke to leave. He was waiting for him to notice something else. Luke slowly pressed the slightly lowered stone again. This time it shifted less than half an inch before stopping. Somewhere beneath the floor another quiet click answered. He scanned the fireplace carefully until his eyes settled on a narrow iron poker leaning beside the hearth. The handle had been polished smooth through years of use. He picked it up and gently inserted its tip into the narrow gap surrounding the loose stone. Applying steady pressure instead of force, he eased the block outward. It slid free with surprising precision, revealing a small bronze lever hidden inside the cavity. There was almost no rust. Someone had built the mechanism to endure generations. Luke hesitated. Every lesson from his military training reminded him never to activate an unknown device without understanding the consequences. Yet nothing about the house felt hostile. It felt patient, as though it had been waiting quietly through countless winters for exactly this moment. Ranger looked at him once, then quietly sat beside the hearth again. Luke wrapped his fingers around the cool bronze handle and lowered it slowly. Deep inside the stone wall came the sound of gears engaging after many silent years. Dust drifted gently from the ceiling beams, while the entire fireplace seemed to settle by barely an inch. Then everything became quiet again. At first nothing appeared different. Luke examined every stone across the hearth until he noticed that the wide wooden mantel no longer aligned perfectly with the wall behind it. A narrow shadow had appeared along one side where no opening had existed moments earlier. He carefully placed both hands against the heavy timber and pushed. To his surprise, the entire fireplace pivoted inward several inches with remarkable balance, revealing a concealed passage just wide enough for one person to enter. Cool air flowed steadily from the darkness beyond, carrying the clean scent of underground spring water mixed with old cedar. There was no odor of decay. Instead, the hidden space smelled alive, as though fresh air had quietly circulated through it for decades. Luke switched on his flashlight, keeping the beam low. Stone steps descended into the mountain, each one carefully carved and remarkably dry. Copper pipes ran neatly along one wall before disappearing deeper underground. He crouched beside one of them and placed 2 fingers against the metal. It felt cool, and somewhere inside he sensed the faint vibration of moving water. Whoever built this place had understood engineering as well as survival. Ranger descended first with calm confidence, never rushing beyond the edge of the flashlight's glow. The passage opened into a narrow chamber where shelves lined both walls from floor to ceiling. Every shelf held neatly organized boxes labeled by year. Glass jars filled with carefully preserved seeds stood beside rolled maps secured with faded blue ribbons. A wooden workbench occupied the far corner beneath a small oil lamp that remained spotless despite the passing years. Luke brushed away a thin layer of dust and noticed that someone had written a simple sentence directly into the wood with a carving knife. Preserve truth before comfort. The words lingered in his mind longer than he expected. They sounded less like advice and more like a life lived on purpose. On the workbench rested a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age but carefully protected inside a waxed canvas sleeve. Luke opened the first page slowly. The handwriting was immediately familiar from the message behind the photograph upstairs. Jonathan Warren. The opening line read, "If you have reached this room, then the mountain has accepted you before I ever could." Luke continued reading, his flashlight resting quietly across the page. Warren described. Luke stood motionless as the voice filled the hidden chamber with a calm certainty that seemed untouched by time. It was unmistakably Jonathan Warren. Older than Luke remembered, perhaps a little more weathered, but carrying the same steady confidence that had once settled every nervous heartbeat before difficult missions. If you are hearing this, then Ranger found the path exactly as I prayed he would. If he is standing beside you now, give him the thanks he deserves. Dogs have always understood loyalty better than we ever will. Luke looked down at Ranger, who simply sat beside him with quiet patience, his alert, intelligent eyes fixed on the tape recorder as though he had been waiting to hear that voice again. Luke felt an unexpected warmth rise inside him. For the first time in years, the silence surrounding his past no longer felt empty. Warren continued, "You probably have more questions than answers, and that is exactly how this journey must begin. If everything had been explained too soon, none of this would have survived." The tape clicked softly before the voice resumed. Thomas Dawson believed that truth should never belong to one man. He believed it should be protected until the right person could carry it forward. "Your father never told you about this place because we made him promise not to. We hoped you would never need it." Luke lowered his eyes. Memories of quiet evenings in his father's garage drifted back to him. Thomas had always seemed to carry stories he never shared, smiling gently whenever Luke asked about his years in uniform. At the time, Luke assumed those were simply painful memories left behind. Now he wondered how many promises had rested silently beneath those conversations. Warren spoke again. "If you are standing here, then life has probably taken more from you than it should have. I am sorry for that. But do not mistake loss for failure. Sometimes the strongest foundations are only discovered after everything built above them has disappeared." Luke slowly pulled a nearby stool closer to the workbench and sat down, listening with complete attention. Ranger remained beside him without moving. The tape recorder continued turning steadily, its gentle mechanical rhythm echoing through the stone chamber like the ticking of an old clock that had refused to surrender to time. "You are not here because of inheritance," Warren said. "You are here because of responsibility. This house has never belonged to a single family. It has belonged to every honest promise made inside these mountains." Luke's flashlight wandered across the shelves surrounding him. Hundreds of carefully labeled journals rested beside rolled engineering drawings, weather records, survey maps, handwritten correspondence, and boxes secured with wax seals that had never been broken. Nothing looked valuable in the ordinary sense, yet every item had been preserved with extraordinary care. Someone had devoted decades to protecting knowledge instead of possessions. Warren's voice softened. "Open the third drawer beneath the workbench." Luke slid the heavy wooden drawer outward. Inside rested several neatly folded letters tied together with blue ribbon. On top lay an envelope bearing his name in handwriting he had not seen since childhood. Luke Dawson. His fingers hesitated before touching it. The paper had yellowed with age, yet the ink remained perfectly clear. Beneath the envelope rested a brass key attached to a leather tag stamped with a single word. "Library." Luke carefully opened the envelope first. The letter inside was written by Thomas Dawson. "My son, if you are reading this, then life has carried you farther into hardship than I ever wished. I wanted to tell you about this place many times. I almost did on your graduation day. I almost did before your first deployment. But Jonathan reminded me that a refuge only matters when someone truly needs one. If that day has come, then remember this above everything else. A man's worth is never measured by what has been taken from him. It is measured by what he still chooses to protect." Luke closed his eyes for a long moment as emotion quietly settled over him. He had searched for explanations ever since losing his home, his work, and nearly every certainty that once defined him. Yet his father had somehow known that one day Luke would need encouragement more than instructions. Ranger gently rested his head against Luke's knee. Luke smiled faintly and scratched behind the dog's ears before wiping away the moisture gathering at the corner of his eyes. He picked up the brass key and examined it beneath the flashlight. The craftsmanship matched everything else inside the mountain, practical, durable, and built to last. Warren's recorded voice returned one final time. The answers you seek are not stored in this room. They are waiting where memory is protected better than stone. Take the library key upstairs. When you unlock the final cabinet, you will begin to understand why someone has spent 30 years trying to make sure this house would never be found. And Luke, once you see what has been hidden there, your life will never look the same again. Luke climbed the narrow stone staircase with the brass key resting heavily in his hand, not because of its weight, but because of everything it now represented. The hidden chamber no longer felt like a forgotten shelter buried beneath a mountain. It felt like the quiet heartbeat of a promise that had survived decades of storms, silence, and sacrifice. Ranger walked beside him without hesitation, his steady footsteps echoing softly against the ancient stone until they reached the main room once again. The first pale light of dawn had begun filtering through the narrow gaps in the shutters, painting long golden ribbons across the worn pine floor. Dust drifted lazily through the beams of morning sunlight, giving the old house the peaceful stillness of a place waking after a long sleep. Luke crossed toward the wall of bookshelves he had noticed earlier. Hundreds of volumes stood in perfect order, their leather bindings faded by time, but carefully maintained. At the center stood a taller cabinet made from dark walnut, its glass doors covered by a delicate iron lattice. Unlike everything else in the room, this cabinet carried a small brass lock shaped exactly like the key Warren had left behind. Luke paused for a moment before sliding the key into the lock. It turned smoothly with almost no resistance. The mechanism released with a gentle click, and the cabinet doors slowly opened inward. Instead of books alone, the shelves contained dozens of leather journals, thick document cases, rolled blueprints secured with blue ribbons, and carefully labeled wooden boxes. Every item carried dates stretching back more than 40 years. Ranger quietly approached the lowest shelf and sniffed one particular journal before looking toward Luke. Luke lifted it carefully. Embossed across the cover in faded gold letters were the words Mountain Steward Records. Inside, every page had been written by hand. The entries described water levels, weather patterns, maintenance schedules, repairs to hidden pipes beneath the mountain, and detailed notes about springs feeding nearby valleys. Whoever maintained these records had treated the mountain itself like a living responsibility instead of a piece of property. Luke reached for another journal. This one contained handwritten letters from families thanking Jonathan Warren and Thomas Dawson for helping preserve wells during severe droughts decades earlier. Several small farming communities credited anonymous volunteers with preventing their land from drying out during difficult summers. No newspapers had reported those efforts. No monuments had ever been built. The work had simply been done because someone believed it was the right thing to do. Luke smiled quietly as he imagined his father carrying lumber through these forests without ever telling anyone why. On the highest shelf rested a long wooden case lined with green felt. Inside lay dozens of rolled survey maps. Luke carefully spread the largest one across the oak table. It showed the entire mountain range in remarkable detail. Thin blue lines traced underground streams flowing beneath the valleys before joining into one enormous spring directly beneath the stone house. Copper tunnels, storage chambers, pressure gates, and hidden maintenance passages formed an intricate network unlike anything Luke had expected to find. This place had never been built simply as a cabin. It had been designed as the guardian of an entire watershed. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears rotated toward the eastern wall. Instead of barking, he walked across the room and stopped beneath a framed landscape painting hanging above a narrow writing desk. He sniffed once, then gently touched the lower corner of the frame with his nose. Luke walked over and studied the painting more closely. It depicted the mountain during springtime, wildflowers blooming across open hillsides, while sunlight reflected from a crystal-clear lake below. Something about its position seemed slightly uneven. Luke carefully lifted the frame from its hooks. Behind it, hidden inside the wall, rested a shallow steel compartment no larger than a briefcase. There was no lock, only a single leather folder tied shut with faded blue cord. Luke untied the cord slowly and opened the folder. Inside rested property deeds, engineering certifications, historical surveys, and legal correspondence spanning several decades. At first, the documents appeared ordinary. Then one page immediately caught his attention. Across the top, stamped in bold letters, were the words Emergency Land Transfer Proposal. The signatures below belonged to Jonathan Warren and Thomas Dawson, but another signature appeared beneath theirs. Grant Hale. Luke frowned. The name stirred something faint in his memory. Hale Ridge Development. The construction company whose trucks he had passed while driving through the valley the previous afternoon. Another document followed. Then another. Each carried the same family name connected to repeated attempts to purchase the mountain, acquire surrounding water rights, or gain access to the hidden engineering systems beneath the land. Every proposal had been denied. Attached to the final page was a handwritten note from Jonathan Warren. If you are reading this, then Hale never stopped searching. He will not be looking for treasure. He will be looking for what this mountain quietly protects. At that exact moment, Ranger stiffened. He moved quickly toward the nearest window, staring through the narrow gap in the shutter. Luke stepped beside him and looked down the mountainside. Far below, barely visible between the trees, several dark vehicles were climbing the old logging road toward the hidden valley, moving slowly but unmistakably in the direction of the stone house. Luke watched the vehicles inch upward through the forest until the trees swallowed them again. There were 4 of them, moving slowly along an abandoned logging road that should have led nowhere near the hidden house. Their appearance could have been dismissed as coincidence if not for Jonathan Warren's final warning resting open on the table beside him. Hale never stopped searching. The words echoed inside Luke's thoughts with growing weight. Ranger remained motionless by the window, his ears standing high, his alert, intelligent eyes following sounds too distant for human hearing. Luke had learned never to ignore that posture. Ranger was not reacting to fear. He was measuring time. Luke carefully gathered the property deeds, journals, maps, and Warren's handwritten notes into the leather folder before placing everything back inside the hidden compartment. Years of military discipline had taught him that information survived only when protected before questions were asked. He returned the painting to its place on the wall, leaving no obvious sign that anything had been disturbed. The room settled into silence once more, but it no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful. Ranger suddenly walked toward the large survey map still spread across the table. He lowered his nose near one corner where several blue lines converged beneath the drawing of the mountain. Luke studied the symbols more carefully. Tiny handwritten notes appeared beside the underground channels. Pressure Gate 1. East Overflow. Emergency Diversion. Every tunnel beneath the mountain served the movement and protection of water. This was never simply a hidden retreat. It was an engineering system built to preserve something essential for every valley below. Luke remembered the letters thanking Warren and his father for saving wells during years of drought. The realization slowly settled into place. The mountain itself was the treasure. Whoever controlled its hidden springs would quietly control the future of every nearby farm, every ranch, and every small town, depending on those underground aquifers. Suddenly, the repeated purchase offers made perfect sense. Hale had never wanted the house. He wanted what the house protected. Luke opened another document inside the leather folder, one he had overlooked moments earlier. It contained engineering estimates prepared nearly 30 years before. The first page described the underground spring as one of the largest naturally filtered freshwater reserves in the region. A handwritten note across the margin caught his attention. Never allow private ownership. Stewardship only. Luke slowly exhaled. His father had not protected money. He had protected water. Ranger gave a quiet whine and walked toward the front door. Luke followed. The morning air felt colder than before as he stepped onto the weathered porch. Mist drifted across the valley while sunlight slowly climbed above distant ridges, turning the forest into waves of gold and green. Birds sang somewhere beyond the pines, completely unaware that the mountain guarded a secret capable of changing countless lives. Luke noticed fresh tire tracks cutting across the muddy logging road far below. They had not been there the previous evening. Whoever was climbing the mountain knew exactly where they intended to go. As he stood listening, another sound reached him. It was not an engine. It was the steady ringing of metal striking stone somewhere beneath the earth. 1, 2, 3 slow echoes before silence returned. Luke looked toward Ranger. The dog had already turned back inside the house, heading directly toward the fireplace with calm determination. Luke hurried after him. Ranger stood beside the loose stone that had revealed the hidden chamber below. This time he did not touch it. Instead, he stared toward another section of the hearth that Luke had never examined. Kneeling again, Luke ran his fingertips across the smooth granite blocks until he discovered a tiny brass plate almost invisible beneath decades of soot. He cleaned it gently with his sleeve. Tiny engraved letters emerged from beneath the dust. Reservoir Control Archive. Beneath the plate sat another concealed lever, smaller than the first. Luke hesitated only briefly before lowering it. Somewhere below the floor, another sequence of quiet mechanical sounds awakened. A section of the stone wall opposite the fireplace slowly shifted outward, revealing a narrow compartment built into the masonry itself. There was no chest of gold waiting inside, no stack of cash, nothing that resembled the fortune treasure hunters might dream about. Instead, a series of thick black binders rested neatly upon wooden shelves, each labeled by year. Luke removed the newest binder and opened it. The first pages contained names, addresses, photographs, legal case numbers, foreclosure notices, insurance disputes, and handwritten timelines connecting dozens of families across several counties. Every case involved former service members who had somehow lost homes, farms, businesses, or inherited land through strangely similar financial disputes. Luke's hands stopped turning the pages when he reached the final section. Staring back at him from the last page was his own photograph, clipped from a newspaper article published only 2 years earlier. Beneath it, someone had typed a single sentence. Subject successfully displaced. Property acquisition completed through indirect financial pressure. Luke felt the room grow impossibly quiet. He had believed his life had collapsed because of unfortunate decisions and relentless bad luck. He had spent countless nights blaming himself for every failure. But the pages before him told a different story entirely. His losses had followed a pattern already repeated against many others. They had not happened by accident. They had been carefully arranged. At that exact moment, a tiny green light blinked alive near the top corner of the hidden archive, followed by the almost inaudible click of a camera quietly focusing on the room. Luke froze for only a fraction of a second before years of disciplined training quietly took over. Panic had never solved the mission. Observation always came first. The tiny green light blinked steadily from the corner of the concealed archive, no larger than the indicator on an old security sensor. It did not sweep across the room or follow his movement. It simply remained fixed, almost forgotten, until someone noticed it. Luke stepped closer, studying the small device without touching it. The casing looked older than modern equipment, carefully hidden behind the wooden beam where few people would ever think to search. Ranger stood silently beside him, his ears forward, his breathing calm. The dog showed no sign of alarm. Whatever the device was, it had not been placed there to threaten anyone inside the house. Luke reached beneath the beam and found a thin brass plaque mounted behind the sensor. Dust covered most of the engraving, but after wiping it gently with his sleeve, he could finally read the faded words. Archive Status Indicator. Manual Signal Relay. He looked back toward the binders resting inside the hidden compartment. Jonathan Warren had never described the mountain as a fortress. He had described it as a responsibility. The green light was not watching him. It was announcing that someone had opened the archive after many years of silence. Somewhere beyond the mountain, another matching indicator might now be glowing for the first time in decades. Luke carefully closed the binder containing his own file and returned it to its exact position beside the others. He took several photographs of the pages with his old phone, even though there was no signal inside the mountain. The images would remain stored until they could be transmitted later. He then photographed the labels on every binder, noticing they stretched across more than 30 years. The pattern was unmistakable. Every folder documented another family connected to military service, another property quietly transferred after financial hardship, another piece of land eventually acquired by companies carrying different names but sharing the same legal representatives. Ranger suddenly turned toward the front of the house. His head lifted slightly before he walked to the doorway leading back upstairs. Luke trusted the signal immediately. They climbed from the hidden archive into the morning light, replacing the concealed panel exactly as they had found it. Nothing inside the room suggested anyone had discovered its secrets. Outside, the air carried the fresh scent of pine and wet earth after the night's rain. Sunlight now reached deeper into the valley, revealing patches of golden leaves scattered across the forest floor like quiet lanterns. Luke stepped onto the porch just as the distant sound of engines faded into silence. The vehicles had stopped somewhere below the ridge. They were close enough to arrive on foot, yet no voices drifted upward through the trees. The mountain seemed to be holding its breath. Rangers suddenly trotted down the stone steps and followed a narrow footpath circling behind the house. Luke followed, discovering a small spring flowing from beneath the cliff into a shallow stone basin. Crystal clear water spilled gently over hand-cut channels before disappearing into the forest below. Beside the spring stood a weathered wooden bench facing the valley. An elderly woman wearing a faded brown sweater and a dark green rain jacket sat quietly on the bench as though she had been expecting the morning all along. Her silver hair was gathered neatly beneath a wool cap, and her gentle blue eyes rested on the flowing water instead of the approaching footsteps. She did not appear startled when Luke stopped several yards away. Instead, she smiled with the quiet familiarity of someone greeting an old friend. "You have Thomas's eyes," she said softly. Her voice carried the warmth of countless autumn evenings beside fireplaces and front porches. Luke exchanged a quick glance with Ranger before answering. "You knew my father?" The woman nodded slowly. "For more years than either of us expected. And I knew Jonathan even longer." She rose carefully from the bench, leaning only lightly on a polished walking stick carved from mountain ash. "My name is Evelyn Carter. Jonathan asked me to keep watch over this place for as long as I was able. I stopped coming every week several years ago because I believed no one would ever find the path again." Her gaze shifted toward Ranger, and her smile widened with quiet affection. "I was wrong," he remembered. Luke felt the morning grow strangely lighter despite the unanswered questions filling his mind. "Those vehicles," he asked. "Who are they?" Evelyn's expression remained calm, but a shadow crossed her eyes. She looked toward the distant logging road before answering. "Grant Hale finally knows someone has opened the mountain. He has spent half his life searching for what Jonathan protected, but there is something he still does not understand." She looked directly at Luke. "He believes the greatest secret is hidden inside this house. It is not. The greatest secret has been waiting inside you ever since your father made a promise that changed all of our lives." Evelyn Carter rested both hands upon the carved walking stick as the mountain spring continued flowing beside them with quiet determination, the clear water slipping over smooth stones exactly as it had for generations. Luke waited patiently, sensing that whatever she was about to say had remained unspoken for many years. Ranger settled near the edge of the spring, lowering his head to drink before lifting it again, his alert, intelligent eyes never leaving the forest beyond the trees. Evelyn smiled softly. "Jonathan always believed the mountain would decide when the truth should return. None of us believed we would live long enough to see that day." Luke glanced toward the valley below where the distant logging road disappeared beneath the autumn canopy. "You said my father made a promise that changed everything. What promise?" Evelyn nodded slowly, as though she had rehearsed the answer countless times but never expected to speak it aloud. "Nearly 30 years ago, this mountain became the center of a quiet battle. Not over gold, not over land, over water. Jonathan discovered that the underground springs beneath this ridge could provide clean drinking water to thousands of families for generations if they remained protected. Engineers estimated the reserve was one of the largest naturally filtered freshwater systems anywhere in this region. A handful of powerful investors wanted control of it before anyone else understood its value." She bent down and touched the flowing water with gentle fingertips before continuing. "Jonathan refused every offer. So did your father. They believed no single person should ever own something every family depended upon." Luke looked back toward the hidden house, standing silently against the mountainside. "Then why keep it secret?" Evelyn smiled sadly. "Because secrecy was the only way to keep greed from arriving too soon. Jonathan built legal protections. Your father helped build something even stronger. Trust." She reached into the canvas satchel resting beside the bench and carefully removed a weathered leather folder sealed with blue wax. The same mountain symbol Luke had seen throughout the house appeared pressed into the seal. Evelyn handed the folder to him. "Open it." Inside rested several folded documents, an old photograph, and a single handwritten certificate. Luke unfolded the photograph first. It showed Jonathan Warren, Thomas Dawson, and several local farmers standing beside the very spring where Luke now stood. Everyone smiled naturally, their work clothes covered with mud instead of medals. On the back Jonathan had written, "Some victories are measured in harvests, not headlines." Luke felt the quiet weight of those words settle deep inside him. He unfolded the certificate next. Across the top appeared the title Stewardship Covenant. Beneath it were signatures belonging to Jonathan Warren, Thomas Dawson, county officials, engineers, and community representatives from decades earlier. The agreement declared that the mountain, its springs, and every hidden engineering system beneath it could never become private property. Instead, a single steward would hold legal responsibility for protecting the land on behalf of every surrounding community. The steward could never sell the mountain, divide it, or profit from the water itself. The responsibility could only pass to another individual chosen according to the covenant. Luke looked up. "Why show this to me?" Evelyn answered without hesitation. "Because your father never accepted ownership. He accepted guardianship. When he grew older, Jonathan prepared new documents naming the next steward." Luke slowly turned another page. His own name appeared halfway down the document. Luke Dawson, designated successor steward. Signed 23 years earlier. His hands remained perfectly still. "I was 17, he whispered. Evelyn nodded. "Your father never wanted you to know until you had built a life of your own. He hoped you would never need this responsibility." Jonathan agreed. They believed a steward should come by choice, not by inheritance. Luke remembered the countless times his father had encouraged him to make his own decisions, even when they disagreed. For years he had wondered why Thomas never tried to persuade him to stay close to home. Now the answer finally made sense. His father had trusted that if the day ever came, the mountain itself would call him back. Ranger suddenly stood and walked toward Luke, gently pressing his shoulder against his leg. Luke rested one hand on the dog's neck as he stared once more at his own name written across the aging document. The realization settled quietly inside him. He had followed Ranger into the forest believing the hidden house might offer shelter after losing everything. Instead, every step had led him toward a responsibility his father had accepted long before Luke ever wore a uniform. Evelyn looked toward the valley where the faint outline of parked vehicles remained barely visible through the trees. "Grant Hale believes he is chasing a forgotten property worth millions of dollars," she said softly. "He still does not understand that the greatest value here cannot be bought." Luke carefully folded the covenant and returned it to the leather folder. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine across the ridge as sunlight finally reached the old stone house. Somewhere below, a vehicle door quietly closed. Ranger lifted his head immediately, his ears turning toward the sound. Evelyn's peaceful expression faded for the first time. "They are no longer searching for the mountain," she whispered. "They know exactly where to find it now." Luke stood in silence for several long moments, holding the leather folder against his chest while the morning breeze stirred the golden leaves around the old spring. The mountain no longer felt like a mystery waiting to be solved. It felt like a responsibility waiting to be accepted. He looked toward Evelyn, searching her calm face for the one question that still refused to leave his mind. "If Jonathan and my father knew people would keep coming after this place, why did they leave everything here?" Evelyn smiled gently. "Because truth hidden forever becomes useless. Truth hidden until the right moment becomes protection." She slowly turned toward the stone house. Jonathan believed one day someone would arrive who had already lost enough to understand that protecting something is more important than owning it. Luke lowered his eyes for a moment. Until yesterday, he believed losing his home had been the final chapter of his life. Now it appeared to be the first step towards something his father had quietly prepared decades before. Ranger suddenly stood, his posture changing with the same focused calm Luke had trusted throughout countless missions. The adult German shepherd looked toward the northern tree line instead of the logging road below. His ears remained perfectly still while his nose tested the cool air. Luke immediately recognized the signal. Someone was approaching on foot. Not many people, just one. Neither Luke nor Evelyn spoke. The forest itself seemed to pause as faint footsteps gradually became audible beneath the whisper of moving leaves. A few moments later, a middle-aged man wearing a brown canvas jacket stepped carefully from between the pines, raising one empty hand before coming any closer. His expression carried caution rather than fear. "I was hoping I would find someone here," he said quietly. My name is Mason Reed. I am an attorney in Millbrook. Luke remained where he stood. How did you find this place? Mason glanced briefly toward Ranger before answering. Not by chance. Jonathan Warren mailed me a sealed envelope almost 6 years ago with instructions never to open it unless the archive signal became active again. He reached inside his leather briefcase and carefully removed a cream-colored envelope bearing the same mountain seal Luke had seen throughout the house. The wax had already been broken. Yesterday afternoon, a small receiver in my office lit up for the first time in decades. Inside this envelope, Jonathan instructed me to come here immediately if that ever happened. Evelyn nodded without surprise. He always planned farther ahead than the rest of us. Mason smiled faintly. That appears to be true. He handed Luke several neatly organized documents. These are copies of county land records, trust agreements, and court filings that Jonathan asked me to preserve independently. I never understood why until this morning. Luke quickly reviewed the papers. They matched many of the records hidden inside the mountain, but one folder immediately stood apart. It contained recent filings submitted by Hale Ridge Development requesting emergency drilling permits across several properties surrounding the watershed. Survey maps marked proposed excavation sites less than 2 miles from the hidden spring. Mason pointed toward the diagrams. They have been trying to acquire neighboring parcels one owner at a time. Most people assumed they wanted limestone deposits. The paperwork says otherwise. Luke studied the engineering notes attached to the application. Every drilling location surrounded the underground water system like points on a circle. None of the proposals mentioned the spring directly, yet together they would eventually place control of every access route into private hands. Evelyn folded her arms quietly. Jonathan feared this exact strategy. Never attack the center. Surround it until there is nowhere left to protect. Mason nodded. The first public hearing for the drilling permits is tomorrow afternoon at the county courthouse. Luke looked up. Tomorrow? Yes, Mason replied. Most of the affected families have no idea what lies beneath their land. They believe they are simply discussing mineral leases. Luke looked toward the mountain, then back toward the valley below. Everything suddenly fit together. The hidden records, the foreclosure files, the years of carefully documented property transfers. Hale had never rushed because he never needed to. He had patiently assembled every piece until only the mountain remained outside his reach. Ranger quietly walked toward the porch of the stone house before stopping beside the front steps. He looked back once, waiting. Luke understood. They still had one day before the hearing, and somewhere inside the mountain rested enough evidence to reveal the truth if it could be organized and protected. He closed the leather folder carefully and met Mason's eyes. Then we have less than 24 hours to make sure Jonathan's promise does not end here. At that very moment, the distant silence of the valley was interrupted by the low rumble of heavy machinery starting somewhere below the ridge, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal striking stone. The courthouse in Millbrook had stood on the same brick foundation for more than a century, overlooking a small square where maple trees had begun dropping their bright autumn leaves across the sidewalks. By early afternoon, nearly every seat inside the public hearing room had been filled. Farmers still wearing work boots sat beside retired teachers, local business owners, county engineers, and families who believed they had come to discuss routine land permits. Few of them understood that the future of their community rested quietly beneath the mountains surrounding them. Luke entered through the rear doors wearing the same weathered field jacket he had arrived in the mountains with. Ranger walked calmly at his side, drawing quiet smiles from several people who recognized the steady confidence only a well-trained working dog seemed to carry. Evelyn Carter followed beside Mason Reed, each carrying neatly organized document cases prepared from the mountain archives. No one hurried. No one raised their voice. The truth had waited decades. It could wait a few more minutes. At the front of the room, Grant Hale stood confidently beside a large display showing colorful development plans for new roads, expanded quarry operations, and promises of future jobs. His presentation was polished, respectful, and carefully designed to reassure every person listening. He spoke about economic opportunity, tax revenue, and responsible environmental practices. The audience nodded politely as professionally printed charts appeared across the projector screen. Everything looked reasonable until Mason quietly stood when the public comment period began. He approached the podium carrying only one leather folder. "My name is Mason Reed," he said calmly. "Before any decision is made today, the county deserves to review information that has never been entered into the public record." A few curious voices whispered across the room. Grant Hale maintained his pleasant smile, although his eyes briefly settled on Luke, standing silently near the back wall. Mason carefully placed several original survey maps onto the evidence table. County engineers immediately leaned forward. The blue lines beneath the mountain matched no modern geological surveys. They described an underground freshwater reserve extending beneath multiple communities throughout the valley. Mason then introduced engineering journals signed by Jonathan Warren and certified by licensed hydrologists from decades earlier. The room grew noticeably quieter. Evelyn approached next, placing handwritten maintenance records, stewardship agreements, and letters from local families beside the maps. One elderly farmer slowly stood from his chair before speaking without being invited. "That handwriting belongs to my father," he said softly. "He always told us someone protected our wells during the drought of 1993, but nobody ever believed him." Another woman stepped forward after recognizing her grandmother's signature on one of the preserved community agreements. Then another resident identified an old family photograph showing volunteers repairing mountain pipelines after severe flooding. One memory after another quietly returned, not as rumors, but as living history supported by carefully preserved records. Grant Hale finally approached the podium again, maintaining a calm expression. "These documents are interesting," he said evenly. "But historical records do not change the fact that modern development benefits everyone." Before he could continue, Mason opened a second folder. This time he displayed certified property transfer records, foreclosure timelines, and legal filings gathered from both county archives and Jonathan Warren's hidden collection. The documents revealed an unmistakable pattern stretching across 3 decades. Former service members repeatedly lost inherited land through complicated financial arrangements before neighboring parcels quietly transferred into companies connected through the same corporate network. Several reporters attending the hearing immediately began photographing the evidence. The county commissioners requested additional copies. Luke remained silent. He had no desire to become the center of attention. The documents spoke more honestly than anger ever could. Sheriff Daniel Brooks, who had attended the hearing only as an observer, walked toward the evidence table and carefully reviewed the files himself. After several minutes, he looked toward Grant Hale with visible concern. "These records deserve a formal investigation," he said publicly. "Until that process is completed, I recommend suspending today's permit hearing." A low murmur spread across the room before growing into steady applause from residents who only hours earlier had expected an ordinary county meeting. Grant Hale no longer smiled. For the first time, the confidence that had carried him through the afternoon seemed replaced by quiet uncertainty. Outside the courthouse, television cameras gathered as reporters hurried to confirm the newly presented evidence. Families embraced one another on the courthouse steps while older veterans quietly thanked Luke, without fully understanding how he had uncovered the forgotten records. Luke simply shook their hands. He knew the work was not finished. Truth had finally stepped into the light, but protecting it would require patience equal to the patience that had preserved it for so many years. As the crowd slowly dispersed beneath the golden afternoon sky, rangers suddenly stopped near the courthouse entrance and looked toward a black sedan parked across the street. Inside, someone sat watching the building without stepping out. The engine started quietly, and before the car pulled away, Luke noticed one final detail resting against the windshield. It was a folded sheet of paper bearing the same mountain seal Jonathan Warren had used all those years before. Luke watched the black sedan disappear beyond the courthouse square until it blended into the afternoon traffic. Ranger remained perfectly still, his alert, intelligent eyes fixed on the empty stretch of road long after the vehicle had vanished. Only when the sound of the engine faded completely did the dog relax and turn back toward Luke. A folded sheet of paper still rested near the curb where it had slipped from beneath the sedan's windshield. Luke walked over, picked it up carefully, and unfolded the thick, cream-colored page. The familiar mountain seal appeared at the top, but the handwriting beneath it was not Jonathan Warren's. Instead, it was a brief official notice from the County Historical Preservation Office confirming that an emergency review had been initiated after the hearing. Attached to the notice was a handwritten message in blue ink. Truth only survives when people are willing to stand beside it. Do not return to the mountain alone tonight. There was no signature. Mason Reed studied the note quietly before placing it back into Luke's hands. Someone inside the preservation office knows far more than they have ever said publicly, he observed. Evelyn nodded slowly. Jonathan built more than one circle of trust. We have only met a few of them. Before anyone could continue, Sheriff Daniel Brooks stepped out of the courthouse carrying a folder sealed with the county emblem. His expression remained calm but purposeful. The commissioners voted unanimously, he said. Every drilling permit connected to Hale Ridge development has been suspended pending a full investigation. State environmental officials have already requested copies of the records you presented today. Luke accepted the news without celebration. He had learned long ago that the first honest decision rarely ended a difficult journey. It simply opened the door for many more. Sheriff Brooks continued. There is something else. Financial investigators compared your archive documents with county records this afternoon. They found multiple property transfers that deserve immediate review, including your own foreclosure. Luke looked up quietly. My house. Brooks nodded. Several signatures connected to those transactions do not match the original filings. The investigation will determine exactly what happened, but there is enough evidence to suspend further ownership changes until everything is verified. Luke did not answer immediately. The white farmhouse he had believed was lost forever suddenly returned to his thoughts, not as a possession, but as another piece of a much larger truth. Around them, reporters continued interviewing residents whose families appeared throughout Jonathan Warren's journals. Elderly farmers embraced grandchildren, while veterans who had once believed their stories had been forgotten quietly thanked Mason and Evelyn for preserving the records. One retired firefighter approached Luke holding an old photograph recovered from the courthouse display. My father helped repair those mountain pipelines, he said with a grateful smile. He always told us someone would finish what they started. I guess today we finally met that someone. Luke shook his head gently. My father and Jonathan started it. Ranger simply helped me find the path. The older man smiled warmly before kneeling to scratch behind Ranger's ears. Then maybe he deserves more credit than the rest of us. Soft laughter spread through the small gathering, easing the weight that had filled the courthouse only an hour earlier. As evening approached, the county commissioners invited everyone back into the hearing room for one final announcement. The chairman stood before the audience holding the original stewardship covenant inside a protective archival sleeve. After reviewing the historical agreements, engineering records, and legal certifications presented today, he said, the county formally recognizes the mountain watershed as a protected community trust established under the original covenant. Effective immediately, the property and all associated stewardship responsibilities shall remain permanently preserved according to its founding agreement. The room answered with quiet applause rather than celebration. It felt less like a victory and more like the restoration of something that had quietly belonged to everyone all along. The chairman then turned toward Luke. Mr. Dawson, county records now recognize you as the designated steward identified within the original covenant. This position grants responsibility rather than ownership. On behalf of the communities protected by these waters, we thank you for accepting what your father once carried. Luke stood slowly, humbled by words he had never expected to hear. I cannot promise that every road ahead will be easy, he said. But I can promise this mountain will never be treated like something that can be bought or sold. The audience rose together in a standing ovation, not for wealth recovered or land protected, but for a promise renewed across generations. As the final applause slowly faded, Ranger quietly walked to the courthouse window overlooking the distant mountains. Beyond the evening light, the ridge stood peaceful beneath a sky painted gold and blue. For the first time since arriving there, Luke realized the mountain no longer felt like a place calling him home. It felt like home itself had patiently waited until he was finally ready to answer. Autumn settled gently across the mountain during the weeks that followed, covering the trails with golden leaves that whispered beneath every careful step. The old stone house no longer stood hidden in silence. Its windows glowed warmly each evening, not because it had become famous, but because it had become useful once again. Luke Dawson returned every morning to the spring before sunrise, walking beside Ranger through the quiet forest exactly as they had on the day everything changed. The water still flowed with the same steady rhythm, untouched by headlines or courtroom decisions, reminding him that the most important things in life rarely needed applause to prove their worth. The state investigation continued for months, confirming what Jonathan Warren had documented decades before. Several fraudulent property transfers were reversed, including the foreclosure that had taken Luke's farmhouse. Financial records connected to Hale Ridge development were examined, and multiple families recovered land they had believed was lost forever. The county permanently protected the mountain watershed through expanded conservation agreements, ensuring that no future company could quietly gain control over the springs hidden beneath the ridge. Yet whenever reporters asked Luke how he felt about everything that had happened, he always answered with the same quiet sentence: "The mountain never belonged to me. I only promised to take care of it." Those words spread farther than he ever expected. Volunteers began arriving on weekends to repair old trails, restore neglected cabins, and help preserve the historic engineering system Jonathan and Thomas had spent so many years protecting. Retired veterans offered their skills without asking for recognition. Local students cataloged journals from the hidden archive so future generations could understand the story that had almost disappeared. Engineers carefully restored the underground channels while environmental scientists documented the remarkable purity of the spring water. The old house slowly transformed into a place where history, service, and hope quietly lived together beneath the same roof. Luke refused every offer to commercialize the property. He declined interviews that promised book deals and television appearances. He politely rejected proposals to turn the mountain into a tourist attraction. Instead, he converted 2 guest rooms into temporary lodging for veterans rebuilding their lives after difficult seasons. Some stayed only a few nights. Others remained for several months while searching for new work or simply rediscovering peace they thought had been lost forever. Every visitor was welcomed with a warm meal, a quiet porch overlooking the valley, and the understanding that nobody needed to explain their scars before sitting beside the fire. Ranger became the unofficial guardian of the house. Every morning, he greeted newcomers at the front steps with the same calm dignity that had guided Luke into the forest that unforgettable night. Children laughed as he patiently accepted gentle pats behind his ears. Older veterans often knelt beside him without saying a single word, finding unexpected comfort in the steady presence of a dog who seemed to understand silence better than conversation. Many evenings Luke would find Ranger resting near the old fireplace where the hidden passage remained carefully preserved behind its moving stone wall. Sometimes he wondered whether the dog remembered every step that had led them there, or whether he had simply followed an instinct that no human could ever fully explain. One crisp December afternoon, after the first light snowfall covered the mountain in quiet white, Luke carried a small wooden plaque onto the front porch. He secured it beside the old oak door beneath the weathered bronze emblem that had first captured his attention. The plaque bore only 4 simple words: Stonehaven Stewart House. Nothing more was needed. Evelyn Carter smiled when she saw it for the first time. "Jonathan would have approved," she said softly. Mason Reed nodded in agreement. "So would your father." As the winter sun slowly disappeared behind the western ridge, Luke stood on the porch with one hand resting gently on Ranger's neck. Together they watched the valley below where small farmhouse lights began appearing one by one across the countryside. Families prepared evening meals. Children hurried home before dark. Wells continued providing clean water just as they had for generations, most people never realizing how close they had come to losing something so ordinary and yet so precious. Luke no longer measured his life by what had been taken from him. The house he once lost could eventually be rebuilt. Money could come and go. Even painful memories soften with time. But trust, once protected and passed from one generation to the next, became something far stronger than ownership. He finally understood why his father had never spoken about the mountain. Some promises could not be inherited through words alone. They had to be discovered through character. Ranger quietly leaned against his leg as a gentle wind carried the scent of pine across the snowy hillside. Luke smiled toward the fading light, feeling neither rich nor famous, only deeply grateful. He had entered the forest believing he had lost every place that could ever feel like home. Instead, a loyal dog had led him to a hidden house where he discovered that the greatest inheritance was never the land beneath his feet. It was the chance to protect something that would continue giving life long after his own footsteps had faded from the mountain trail.